Here we are in the beginning of Chumash Devarim, and Chumash Devarim is, of course, a repeat of the previous four books. Moshe Rabbeinu goes over the story of the Jewish people in the desert, and he also reviews the laws that they have to know. And of course, he gives them a pep talk the entire time, trying to inspire them before he leaves from this world. And of course, it's also always it's always Shabbos Chazoin. Shabbos of Devarim, according to our calendar, is always set up to be the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av, when we read the Haftarah of Chazoin Yeshayahu, the vision that Isaiah the prophet had about the city of Jerusalem. So I'm going to focus today on one pasuk in the parsha. And the pasuk, the verse, talks about the Jewish people who are traveling through the land of Edom. Their cousins, who were not very happy to see them, that lived on the border on the way into the land of Israel. And the Jewish people asked for permission to simply cross through their land on the way in to the land of Canaan. And they said, if you let us go through, Oichel bakesef tashvirenu, we will buy food for money. Umayim bakesef v'shasisi, I'm forgetting the Hebrew exactly. And I will buy water also for money. So basically, it's a good financial incentive for you. We got a few million people traveling through your land, and we will buy food and drink from you. Of course, the Jewish people did not have to do that. They had their own internal mun supply, as well as well of Miriam supply. So they were good for both food and water. But they were offering anyway to buy the food and the water, just to give them, kind of throw them a bone for letting them walk through their territory. And of course, the Edomians said, no, if you try, we're going to come against you with a sword. And the Jewish people had to try other paths. Moab didn't let, Ammon didn't let. And of course, they ended up going through the land of Sichon and Og.
What did Rebbe call them? Edomians?
Edomians.
Edomians.
Edomians, that's the English word.
No, I usually heard Edomites.
Oh, well, in the book of Josephus, since Tisha B'Av is coming up, when we can read the book of Josephus, there he calls them Idumeans, Idumeans. But Edomites is good too. Same thing.
It starts with which letter?
I.
I-D, not E.
I-D-U. No, exactly. That's what he calls them. I don't know, whatever. It's the same thing.
Idumeans. Shkoyach, thank you.
Sure. Anyway, the point is that the Gemara learns from this pasuk, from this verse, that just like the water that they were going to buy from these Edomites, let's call them, who were not Jewish, obviously, that water was going to be sheloi nishtana al yedei ha'esh, unchanged by fire. They were not planning to buy hot water. They were going to buy naturally occurring water, spring water, rainwater, whatever it is. So just like the water was going to be unchanged through fire, so too the food had to be unchanged through fire. Meaning to say, food that was cooked and thus changed through fire, they would not buy, because those Edomites were obviously not Jewish. And the halacha says that if a non-Jewish person cooks food, even if it's 100% kosher, the ingredients are kosher, and the pot and pan is kosher, everything seems fine, but it was cooked by a non-Jew, that food is called bishul akum. It's food cooked by a non-Jew, and it's forbidden for a Jew to eat. The reason for that is that the sages were concerned that if the Jewish people would eat non-Jewish cooked food, they would end up socializing with non-Jews, and that socializing could lead to intermarriage. Connections, friendly connections, you eat, you schmooze, you talk, you get to know people, and that could lead to intermarriage. So that's the laws of Bishul Akum. Now, the truth is that the laws of Bishul Akum are really rabbinic. And how do we take a rabbinic law and work it into a verse in the Torah? If it's in a verse in the Torah, it should be a Torah law, not a rabbinic law. It should be one of the 365 negative commandments. But in fact, this is what our sages call an asmachta. Asmachta means a support. That means it is a rabbinic law, and the verse is not really saying what they're saying it's saying. It's simply a support. They use the verse and they say, well, we could interpret it this way, and we're telling you to remember our law based on this verse. So therefore, it's not considered a Torah law. It's considered a rabbinic law, which has a support from the Torah law. Okay, now I'm going to jump from Parshas Devarim to the end of Tractate Avodah Zarah. Many people have a custom in the 9 days to make a siyum, that is to say, to finish a tractate of Talmud. If you make a siyum, then under certain conditions, you can actually eat meat. It's forbidden generally to eat meat during these 9 days, except on Shabbos. But if you have a mitzvah meal, then you can eat meat. So many people try to make a siyum in these 9 days to be able to eat meat. Now, what I'm doing now is not a siyum because I did not learn the entire tractate of Avodah Zarah. I do apologize. So we're not going to be having any hamburgers or hot dogs after this. But nevertheless, it is what would be studied at a siyum if you were to complete learning that tractate. It's the very end of Tractate Avodah Zarah. Okay, so here goes. I'm going to read the Hebrew, or it's not Hebrew, actually, it's Aramaic, and then the translation. Kiha de Mar Yehuda Ubati Bar Tuvi. The Talmud is talking about the concept of kashering a knife by sticking it into the ground. Who here has heard of that concept? Excellent. I see a few hands up. Very good. So please do not confuse this with the idea of putting silverware into your pot plants and leaving them there for a few days or however long. That is not what I'm talking about. I know it's very common practice, but that is simply a myth that is kind of a mumbo jumbo of different aspects of kashering. The correct concept is that if you have a knife that has some non-kosher stuff, gunk that's attached to it, oily stuff, it's not so easy to get rid of it, even with water. So you basically stick it into hard earth, not too hard because then it won't go in, but not too soft because that's not going to be effective. So, somewhat hard earth, stick it in 10 times in 10 different spots, and the friction of doing so will clean it, and there will be nothing left on the surface whatsoever of non-kosher. Now, that's not to say that there won't be non-kosher flavor still absorbed inside the knife, and that's why you will not be allowed to use this knife to cut something hot, because when you have heat, that can also absorb from what's inside a utensil. But here we're talking about using it only to cut something cold, even if that thing happens to be sharp, like a lemon, or an esrog, like we're going to learn about, an onion, a garlic, whatever it is. You can use this method of kashering, of sticking it into the ground 10 times. So that's what the Talmud is talking about. And the Talmud gives an example. There were two people. One was Mar Yehuda. He was an important personage of the house of the exilarch, of the house of the Reish Kaluz. And there was another fellow by the name of Bati Bar Tuvi. Now, just for your information, if you want to know a bit more about Bati Bar Tuvi, Bati Bartuvi was formerly a slave. Remember, in those days, they still had slavery. And if you were a slave of a Jewish person, you had to keep the same mitzvahs that a Jewish woman had to keep, meaning to say all negative mitzvahs and non-time-bound positive mitzvahs. But nevertheless, these people were not totally Jewish, and they could not marry a Jewish woman. They had to marry another slave, female or male slave, whatever it might be. Now, this Bati Bartuvi was actually freed by his master, but he never ended up receiving a writ of emancipation. In fancier English, it's called something like a document of manumission, which is specifically to be freed from slavery. He never received it, and he could have, but he just felt like he didn't need to, so he never did. So therefore, he was kind of in a state of limbo. He didn't have an owner who could make him work, so he was just, a free man, but he was not technically a fully functioning Jew because he never got that technical document. Anyway, the story goes that these two men, Havu Yasve Kamei de Shavur Malka, they were sitting in front of King Shapur. King Shapur was the king of Persia at that time. Aisu lekamayu esroigo. The servants brought in front of them an esrog. I don't really know who eats esrogim. I mean, I know you can use it to flavor your vodka or to make perfume out of it or whatever, but apparently, sorry?
Pie, after Yontif.
Yep. But here it seems like they were just eating the esrog as is, but maybe it was cooked and they made a dish out of it. I don't know what it was. Pasak ochal, the king cut a piece of the esrog and he ate it. Pasak lahavle lebati bartuvi. Then he cut a piece of the esrog and he gave it to Bati Bartuvi. Hadar dotza asora zimni ba'ara. Then he stuck it into the ground 10 times. It seems like they were eating somewhere in the garden, because obviously in his inner chamber, there's not going to be an earth floor if he's a king. So presumably they were eating outside somewhere, and there was an earth floor beneath them. So he reached down, he stuck the knife into the ground 10 times. Pasak havle lemar Yehuda, and then he gave a piece to Mar Yehuda. Now you might wonder, how did King Shapur know about the laws of kashering? Well, I'll share with you a different siyum from the end of Bava Metzia, from which we see that King Shapur was quite a learned Gentile. The story in the end of the King tractate Bava Metzia is that there's a question about a wall between two fields that are on a different level. You have split level fields, one higher, one lower. And then the wall is kind of connecting them. What if vegetation grows on that wall? Who does the vegetation belong to? So there are different opinions, but Rav Shimon says
it's growing out of the upper part and it's overhanging the lower part.
Exactly. So Rav Shimon says, if whatever the guy in the top field can reach down and reach with his hands belongs to him. Whatever is lower than that belongs to the lower guy. The Talmud finishes and says, Amrua kamei deshvur malka. They said the teaching of Rav Shimon in front of King Shapur. Va'amar, and he said, Apiryain nimtaye le Rav Shimon. I give a yasher koyach to Rav Shimon. He praised the teaching of Rav Shimon. Let us offer praise. Apiryain means praise. Nimtaye means let's give. Let's give praise to Rav Shimon. He was impressed with Rav Shimon's ruling, and he gave him praise. So obviously, King Shapur was a person who studied Torah, even though he wasn't Jewish, but he had an appreciation for Torah and he studied it. So therefore, he knew the laws of kashering, and he kashered the knife for Rabbi Yehuda by sticking in the ground 10 times. Very kind of him. Now Bati Bar Tuvi wakes up. Amarle Bati Bar Tuvi said to him, Vahu Gavra Lav Bar Yisrael, who? Is this person not Jewish? Talking about himself? Like, why did you only kasher the knife for Rav Yehuda, or Mar Yehuda as he's called here? Why didn't you kasher it for me? Amar Le, King Shapur answered him, Mar Kinli Begave. The master, meaning to say Rav Yehuda, I know how particular he is. So therefore, I went out of my way to kasher the knife for him. Umar like Kimli Begave, whereas you, I don't know that you're particular. I don't know your standard of kashrus. So I didn't go out of my way for you. Nothing personal. I didn't know. And finally, the Gemara says, and this is how the tractate ends. It's an interesting ending for a tractate because usually you try to end a tractate on a positive note. But according to the final answer, he says, Amarle, Ikadamri, some say he told him, Amarle, he said to him, Itker my avdis be'urta. Remember what you did last night. You think you're so religious? You think I should kasher the knife for you? Remember what you did last night. I have it on video. No, I'm kidding. Basically, what happened last night is that the custom of the Persian kings was that if they had a guest staying overnight, they would send them a woman. And when those women knocked on the doors of Bati Bartuvi and Mar Yehuda, Bati Bartuvi accepted the gift and invited the woman into his room and did whatever he did with her. And Mar Yehuda said, no, thank you. So therefore, I know Mar Yehuda is frum, he's properly religious, and I know you're not. So that's why I dealt with each of you accordingly. That is the story. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe has a few questions here on this story. Yes, Susan, go ahead.
What about showing respect?
For whom?
For the guy he made an assumption that he knows he's from, but he shows more respect to the non-Jew.
No, on the contrary. He shows respect to the rabbi. He respects the rabbi who keeps the laws of the Torah and refused the gift of the prostitute or whatever you want to call these women. And he did not show respect to the other fellow who showed that his religion is only when it's convenient.
Maybe I don't understand.
There were two people eating with
the two Jews.
I think she's talking about between the king and the two guests, the original thing with the
original thing. That's exactly what we're talking about. The king had two guests. One was Jewish. He had been a Jewish slave, but then he became kind of a free Jew. But he was Jewish in terms of having to keep the laws of kashrus. He was Jewish. And the other one was a Jewish rabbi. And for the Jewish rabbi, he kashered the knife. For the other fellow, he did not kasher the knife. And when the other fellow asked him, why didn't you? He said, I don't really know you. And I'm not so sure that you're so religious, so I didn't do it for you. And some say he reminded him that the previous night, he had accepted this gift of a woman, a prostitute, a concubine, I don't know, whatever you want to call her.
I see. Yeah, I understand what you mean now.
Exactly. Therefore, you're not so religious, so don't pretend. So that's the story. The Lubavitcher Rebbe has a question on the story. It does seem that, or it's clear actually, that this king was a learned person. He knew Jewish laws, and he cared about them. Didn't just know them; he cared about them, like we see from the story with the ruling of Reb Shimon and how impressed he was, and we see how he cleaned the knife for Rav Yehuda. So he cared. Now, if somebody sins in one way, does that mean that he can't be religious in other ways? Why is it not possible to say, yeah, he had a nisoyon, as they say in Hebrew. He had a test. He was tempted. He failed the test. He accepted the woman, but that doesn't mean he's not going to be religious forever after. He's going to stop keeping kosher. He's not going to go to shul. He's not going to keep Shabbos. No. He made a mistake. He did something wrong. Hopefully he'll do tshuva. He'll never repeat it. Well, why should we feed him non-kosher food just because he did something wrong? Like, well, how does that work? That's question number one. Question number two is, in the first version of what the king said, he said, I know Mar Yehuda, but I don't know you. But again, the question comes up. He knew that he was Jewish. So what if he doesn't know him? He doesn't know how careful he is. But Jewish people are supposed to keep kosher. So why not clean the knife? Like, what's the big deal?
Rabbi?
Yes.
It occurs to me also that if the second fellow was of a very humble nature, he might, out of fear or respect for the king, have accepted the woman. I could have kept the door ajar, but he could have accepted the woman into the room without doing anything with her, just to show that he wasn't refusing the gift of the king.
Well, what we're going to see, what you're suggesting is that it was done out of fear of the king and not insulting the king. We are going to see that there is that concept applied to this story in terms of not refusing the king's
Offer.
the king's offering of food. But when it comes to the woman, it doesn't seem like the king would have been insulted because the king wasn't there. It wasn't like the king brought her, obviously. It was the servants that brought her. And if they refused, they refused. You know, not everybody's interested. And whatever, it doesn't seem like the king would have been insulted in that case. So here is a chiddush, as they say in yeshiva language. A chiddush is when you say something new, a new understanding in the matter. Here's the chiddush, my friends. The Rebbe suggests King Shapur was a king. He was a king of Persia, very wealthy man. In a king's house, they don't use one knife, the same knife, to cut their meat products, their dairy products, their fruits and their vegetables. They certainly have plenty of knives, plenty of utensils. And they probably have different knives for different functions. So if he was cutting an esrog with a knife, the chances are that that esrog was actually not used for meat. Because for meat, you probably had a different knife, different shape, different weight, and so on and so forth. And he wouldn't have used the wrong knife to cut a fruit. It would have been the right, appropriate size, etc., for fruits. Therefore, as such,
Rabbi, I think you have to mute.
Knife.
You have to mute the background noise.
Sorry?
You have to mute the background noise.
Oh,
mute
good idea.
The background. Yeah.
Thank you. You can unmute yourselves if you have a question. So the knife had never been used ever for not kosher. So what's the issue? Why do you have to clean it? The answer is it had been used for cooked fruits and vegetables. And therefore it had an issue of bishul akum. It had absorbed the taste of food cooked by Gentiles, which is not kosher, but not because the ingredients aren't kosher, just because it's cooked by a Gentile, and therefore there's a concern that it might lead to socializing and to intermarriage, and therefore the utensils become not kosher as well. This is why, by the way, one of the jobs of a mashgiach in a restaurant or in a catering or whatever, one of the jobs of the mashgiach is to turn on the fires so that it should be considered bishul Yisrael, cooked by a Jew. Because if a Jew turns on the fire or is involved in the cooking in any other significant way, then it's considered to be bishul Yisrael, cooked by a Jew. If you have, by the way, a maid or a housekeeper, and you want them to cook for you, you have to make sure always to turn on the fire, even if all the ingredients are kosher, hopefully they are. Even so, the fire has to be turned on by a Jew for it to be kosher as far as bishul Yisrael is concerned, cooked by a Jew. Now, in truth, I must tell you, there is an argument as to whether the laws of bishul Yisrael affect the utensils or not. There is an opinion, that of the Ra'ah of Aaron HaLevi, that when the sages said that there's laws of bishul Yisrael, bishul akum, what's cooked by a Jew, cooked by a Gentile, they only forbade the actual food, but they didn't forbid the utensil that it was cooked in. And according to them, if it was cooked in a utensil, the utensil is still kosher. The food's not kosher, but the utensil is kosher. And his reasoning is as follows. He says the whole issue with bishul Yisrael, cooked by a Jew, versus bishul akum, cooked by a Gentile, is that it could lead to socializing and intermarriage. Well, that's true if you eat the actual food that the Gentile made. That could lead to socializing and intermarriage. But if you don't eat his food, you just use the pot that he used, but you cook the next round, well, that's not going to lead to intermarriage, because what does that have to do with him? You're just using a pot that he once used. Big deal. So that's why the Ra'ah says that the laws of bishul akum do not affect the utensils. Now, we do not follow that opinion. We follow the opinion of the Rashba, Reb Shlomo ben Aderes, a different scholar and sage, and he holds no, that since the rabbis made a rule that this food is forbidden to eat, therefore it has the law of a forbidden food. And forbidden foods do affect the utensils that they're cooked in. Just because this particular case is not going to lead to intermarriage does not change the fact that it's a forbidden food. And as such, the utensil is forbidden. Going back to the knife of King Shapur, it was a knife that had been used to cut bishul akum. And therefore, he kashered it for Rav Yehuda, or Mar Yehuda, as he's called here. When it came to cutting it for Bati Bartuvi, he did not. And here I have to share with you a piece of information that I forgot to tell you earlier. Tosfos is of the opinion that a slave that is not completely free, which Bati Bartuvi was, that was his status, because he never got that document of emancipation. So according to Tosfos, he still has the status of a slave, and he is allowed to marry or to have relations with a female slave or even a Gentile woman, because he's not fully Jewish. So here's the argument. Here's the understanding. The king said to him, remember what you did last night. He wasn't telling it to him to be rude. He wasn't telling him to say, who do you think you are? You're so religious. He wasn't saying it to embarrass him. He was saying to him, hey, I know what you did last night, and maybe it's okay. Maybe it's fine, because you have a status of being a slave. And by the way, this was not a secret that he was a slave, because we have in a different Talmudic teaching that Rav Yehuda, who presumably is the same person as this Mar Yehuda, once announced that Bati Bartuvi never received a certificate of emancipation. And he made that announcement so people should know that they can't allow their daughters to marry him. So it was common knowledge. And therefore, the king was saying, hey, if you're allowed to have relations with a Gentile woman, so then why can't you have Bishul Akum? The whole concept of Bishul Akum is to prevent socializing and intermarriage. That's if intermarriage is forbidden. However, in this particular case, intermarriage is not forbidden for this fellow. And therefore, why can't you use the same knife? It's only Bishul Akum after all. Now, there is another opinion, that of Rashi. Rashi holds that a slave that is freed, even if he doesn't get his document, is still not allowed to marry or have relations with a Gentile or a slave woman. But still, according to this understanding, what the king was saying is, if you're not keeping the laws of intermarriage, so why are you all of a sudden concerned with keeping the fence around intermarriage? That just doesn't make sense. It's not logical. So that's as far as that story is concerned. Clear? Yes? Now, let's go back to the first version of the conversation. The first version of the conversation was that he said, Mar kimli begave, umar lo kimli begave. I know about the master, Mar Yehuda, and I don't know about the other master, yourself. So therefore, I went out of my way to help him, and I didn't go out of my way to help you. So, and we asked, what's the difference? If he's Jewish, even if you don't know him, why not just stick the knife in the ground and that's it? Help him out, just in case. He is Jewish after all. Jews have to keep kosher. So what's the problem? So here's the concept. And this is something that somebody mentioned earlier. If the king has you as a guest and he offers you something to eat, it's kind of rude to refuse. And if you do something rude in front of the king, you might end up with an unhappy ending. In those days, with absolute dictators who could do whatever they wanted. So the end of that person might not be very happy. So here's what's going on. Bati Bartuvi, it seems, was a religious man. And that's why it bothered him that the king had not cleaned the knife for him. So why did he accept the first slice of esrog that the king gave him without saying anything? Very simple. Because he thought to himself, what am I going to do? I'm going to say no. The king's going to get mad at me. I'm going to tell him to clean the knife for me. What kind of chutzpah is that? For me to ask a king to clean a knife, I mean, I have no choice. I have to eat. In Hebrew, it's what they call pikuach nefesh. I have to save my life. That overrides the kosher laws. And that's exactly what the king knew was going to happen. The king knows these halachas. Like we said before, King Shapur was learned, and he knew that a Jew is allowed to eat something if he's going to otherwise put his life at risk. So he didn't bother helping out Bati to clean the knife because Bati is allowed to, because otherwise his life might be at stake. And there's another consideration here. The halacha is that a king is supposed to be seen in a very respectable and honorable light. It's not appropriate for a king to do something that degrades himself in front of his subjects. For example, a king is not allowed to take a haircut in front of his subjects. He's not allowed to take a shower. he always has to appear immaculate. Obviously, there has to be the barber who gives him a haircut. There has to be the bathhouse attendant who helps him in the bath. Yes. But other than that, the king in public always has to look the best. And the king cannot say, well, I don't mind. Doesn't bother me. I want to be humble. No, there's no such option. Hamelech shemochal al kevoidoi ein kevoidoi mochel. If a king says, I'm willing to forgo my honor, we don't allow him to do that. He must always appear to look respectable and honorable so that people will give him that respect. And that's essential for the government to be able to function. That is that people have fear and respect of the king. So therefore, based on the fact that Bati is going to be allowed to eat this esrog because of his fear for his life, so now it's not so, it seems that it's inappropriate for the king to clean the knife for him, like he's doing him a service, like the king is serving a commoner. That's simply not appropriate. And therefore, he specifically didn't do it. On the other hand, when it came to Mar Yehuda, he did clean the knife. And he explained, Mar Kimli Begave. That master, I know about him. What did he know about him? So for this, we have to turn to a different Gemara. We're learning a lot of Gemara these days, my friends. The other Gemara talks about Rav Yehuda, and it seems that Rav Yehuda and Mar Yehuda are the same person. So what happened was that there was a drought in Babylonia. This is in Brachas, page 20b. And they were praying, and they weren't getting answers. And Rav Papa said to Abaya, why is it that in earlier generations, miracles would happen? And for us, these miracles don't happen. In fact, he said, in earlier generations, they were not as learned as we are. For example, in the generation of Rav Yehuda, they would focus only on the tractates in the Talmud about Nezik and about damages. They didn't focus on all 6 orders of the Mishnah because it was too much. We, on the other hand, we study all 6 orders of the Mishnah. So why did miracles happen to them and not to us? In fact, in the times of Rav Yehuda, the Gemara says, when they needed rain, Rav Yehuda would start to take off his shoes, because on a fast day, they would take off their shoes, like we do on Tisha B'Av. So he would take off his shoes in order to pray on the fast day for rain. As soon as he took off one shoe, even before he took off the second shoe, it would already start to rain. Whereas nowadays, our Papa said, we cause pain to ourselves, meaning to say we fast a lot, and we daven a lot, and nobody answers. What's the reason for this? The Talmud answers, in the earlier generations, meaning to say the generation of Rav Yehuda that you asked about, people would sacrifice their lives to sanctify God's name. We don't do that. We don't give up our lives to sanctify God's name. Now the commentaries discuss, what does that mean? If you're talking about the major sins, well, a person cannot transgress those sins, and they must give up their life rather than commit adultery, idolatry, murder. And certainly Rav Papa's generation, religious people would have done that. So what's the difference between them and the generation of Rav Yehuda? And the commentaries say that Rav Yehuda and his generation would go beyond the letter of the law. And they were, in fact, willing to give up their lives rather than transgress on other sins as well. And this is not something that they have to do, but that's what they did beyond the letter of the law. I don't know if I've ever told the story of the Chafetz Chaim here, but the Chafetz Chaim was a refugee during World War I because the Germans were approaching Radin, where he lived in Poland, and to escape the battles and so on, he and his family took a train to the east into Russia. And they were on the train, and Shabbos was approaching, and the Chafetz Chaim gathered his whole family around. It was a big group. And he said, Shabbos is approaching, and the halacha says that in a case that you need to protect your life, you're allowed to desecrate the Shabbos, and therefore it is appropriate for us to stay on the train even though it's Shabbos, and that's the halacha, and that's that. That's what he said in his public announcement. A few minutes later, when Shabbos was just about to come in, they were looking around for the Chafetz Chaim on the train, and they could not find him. And they realized that he had slipped off the train. The train at that time was not at a station. It was like just in the middle of nowhere. I don't know if it was going very slow or it had stopped momentarily, and he was able to step off. And when the family realized that he had stepped off, they all got off the train, and they joined him in the middle of a field where he was. And it did seem like a bit of a dangerous situation to just stay in the middle of the field. It was wartime and whatever. It did turn out that field was next to a village where Jewish people lived. They heard that the Chafetz Chaim was in the field. They came out and they brought him back into the village, and he ended up spending Shabbos there. And after Shabbos, he continued his trip into Russia, and he ended up surviving the war, of course, and he ended up going back to Radin after the war. Now, the Chafetz Chaim had given a ruling that it is allowed to stay on the train because it was dangerous to leave it. Yet he himself left the train. That means he wanted to keep Shabbos by all costs, by all means, even to put his life in danger. Now you might say, well, he was a tzaddik and he had divine inspiration and he knew he was going to survive. Yeah, that's probably true. But there's something to be said for the idea of putting his life in danger. He didn't give it up like 100%, but he was willing to risk his life to not desecrate the Shabbos at all. So he's going beyond the letter of the law. Not all opinions say you can do this, by the way. Some say there's no option to do that. You must desecrate. When it comes to saving your life or possibly saving your life, you must desecrate. Don't try to be more religious than the Torah. The Torah says you're allowed to desecrate. You must desecrate because you have to save your life. But like I said, there are opinions, and some follow that opinion, that you are allowed to. And that's the meaning that Rav Yehuda would give up his life for sanctifying Hashem's name. He was willing to give up his life rather than commit any sin. Coming back to King Shapur with his guests, we can now understand what the king meant when he said, Mar kimli begavei, umar le kimli begavei. The master, Rabbi Yehuda, I know he will never eat the esrog that I cut with an unclean knife, even if it will put his life in danger. I know he would rather die than eat such food that is not properly kosher. Interestingly enough, based on what we said before, it was kosher ingredients-wise. It was just not kosher because it had the bishul akum flavor in it. And nevertheless, the king said, I am sure that Mar Yehuda will not eat something that's even a little bit not kosher just because I offer it to him. Even though he might say, well, the king could kill me, it's an insult, he doesn't care. He will never eat something non-kosher, even if it means putting his life at risk. And therefore, the king explained, that's why I cut the esrog for him. I wouldn't cut the esrog otherwise, because like we said, a king is not supposed to debase himself in front of his subjects. But in this case, I had no choice. I'm a host. I have to feed my guests. There's no other way he's going to eat. So therefore, I cut it for him. You, on the other hand, I know that you're not going beyond the letter of the law. So for you, it wouldn't be right for me to cut it. And that's why I didn't. So what is the lesson that we can learn from this story the Lubavitcher Rebbe says? First, I'll open it up for discussion if any of you have any ideas. What lesson can be learned? One at a time. Don't forget to press unmute.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Well, perhaps one of the lessons is that that response is being tailored to the person to whom one is responding.
That's definitely true. Definitely true.
And of course, he knew that Rav Yehuda was that particular and that observant in terms of the last letter of the law and spirit of the law.
Yes. This is true. So I'm going to just add to that point. Because here's the lesson the Rav Rebbe learns. Sometimes the person, he's religious, he keeps the Torah, but he has a bit of an inferiority complex. And when he's in the company of maybe an important person, a Gentile, a rich Gentile, a powerful Gentile, he feels he has to cover up his religion. I'm not going to wear a yarmulke. I'm just going to wear a baseball cap. I'm not going to wear my tzitzis out. I'm going to tuck them in. I'm not going to, obviously keep kosher and be different than everybody else. I'll just, maybe I'll give myself a leniency and I'll just, include something non-kosher. I just heard that in the White House Hanukkah party that George W. Bush made. So the first year that he made it, the Reform rabbis, God should bless them, but they didn't want to eat the kosher food because they wanted to eat, the special White House, menu. And the food that they had prepared, even though they had prepared some kosher food, it all got mixed up. And the religious Orthodox people were not able to eat anything. And Barbara Bush, is that her name? George W.'s wife? Or is that George H.'s wife? I don't remember. Whatever her name was, George W. Bush's wife said to the religious Jews, don't worry, next year it's going to be kosher only. And that's what ended up happening. From then on, the Hanukkah White House party has been kosher food only. Anyway, the point is that sometimes a person feels like he has to cover up on his religion and not be so obviously religious in front of people who are not Jewish and so on. And here we see the opposite was true. The one who was not so religious, the king had no respect for him. He's not going to go out of his way to help this guy who doesn't care so much about his own religion. Whereas the one who was super fanatically religious, Rav Yehuda, who he knew would die rather than eat a piece of esrog, which was 99% kosher, meaning to say the esrog itself was kosher. The knife was basically kosher. It just had an absorbed taste of food that was cooked by a non-Jew. Big deal. I mean, it is a big deal, but still, comparatively speaking, you're going to risk your life for that? Yeah, he's going to risk his life. And that's the Jew that he honored and respected and went out of his way to help, because he respected the attitude that I'm going to keep my religion. I'm not going to compromise on it just to make other people happy. So that's a good lesson, hopefully. And I wish you all a happy, it should become a happy Tisha B'Av because Mashiach should come, and then Tisha B'Av will be a holiday. So it should be a happy Tisha B'Av, and we should meet hopefully in the third Holy Temple, the third Beis Hamikdash, very quick.
Thank you,
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Sam.
Pleasure.
Thank you. But Rabbi, I just want to raise one little point that I believe that wearing the tzitzit outside or inside is, I believe it's a minhag because the Sephardic community, at least in New York, where I was, generally speaking, the tzitzit are worn inside.
There are those that wear them inside, and they say that the Arizal says to do that. And if that's your minhag, that's fine. But if your minhag is to wear it outside, don't put it in just because there's somebody watching who makes you uncomfortable. You know what I'm saying? If that's your minhag, then do it wherever you go. But if it's your minhag to wear it out, then do that wherever you go.
100%. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
My pleasure. Thank you all for joining. Have a good Shabbos.
Sabbath.
Thank you.